On June 18, 2020, Wirecard's auditors refused to sign off on its accounts because $1.9 billion in cash, supposedly parked in 2 Philippine bank accounts, could not be found. That is not a rounding error. That sum was roughly a quarter of the company's entire balance sheet, money that was meant to be as solid and verifiable as the floor beneath your feet. A payments giant that processed transactions for millions of people had, it turned out, been holding nothing where the money should have been. Think of Wirecard as a stage magician, performing the classic disappearing coin trick. The audience watches the coin go into the closed fist, sees the fist open empty, and gasps, convinced the coin vanished into another dimension. The truth is duller. The coin was never in the fist at all. By the end of this video, you'll see exactly why the most sophisticated investors in Europe kept clapping for a magician whose sleeves they were allowed to inspect the whole time. At its peak in 2018, Wirecard was worth around $24 billion on the stock market, more than Deutsche Bank, the country's most storied financial institution. It had muscled its way into Germany's prestigious DAX index, the corporate equivalent of being knighted. Politicians cited it as proof that Germany could finally produce a Silicon Valley champion. Here's the first open loop. The very thing that made Wirecard untouchable, its status as a national symbol, was also the thing that let the trick run for years. We'll come back to that national pride in a champion too big to doubt. To understand the trick, you have to understand what Wirecard actually claimed to be. It was a payment processor, the invisible plumbing that moves money when you tap a card. That is a real, dull, low-margin business, mostly a matter of moving pennies a billion times. Wirecard, however, reported the kind of fat profit margins you'd expect from a luxury fashion house, not a back-office plumber. The explanation Wirecard offered was a network of so-called third-party acquirers, outside partners in places like the Philippines, Dubai, and Singapore, who supposedly handled payments in regions Wirecard couldn't operate in directly. These partners, the story went, generated enormous profits that flowed back to headquarters. Crucially, the cash these partners held was booked as Wirecard's own. This is the magician's fist, a sealed container nobody in Asheim ever needed to open for themselves. What everyone gets wrong about Wirecard is the assumption that the fraud was fiendishly clever. Too clever for ordinary mortals to detect. It wasn't. The mechanics were almost crude. Invent revenue from partners that barely existed, then claim the resulting profits were sitting safely in escrow accounts abroad. The genius wasn't in the engineering of the lie. It was in the choice of audience, people who very much wanted the trick to be real. Here is our second open loop. The audience, who could most easily have unmasked it, instead became its loudest defenders. A story will settle in. The short sellers were right. Paying off our first loop, Wirecard's status as Germany's tech darling created a powerful gravitational field. Pension funds held it. Index funds were forced to buy it once it entered the DAX. Analysts who questioned it risked looking unpatriotic and, worse, looking wrong on a stock that kept going up. When a company becomes a symbol of national ambition, scrutiny starts to feel like betrayal. The man at the center was CEO Markus Braun, an Austrian who dressed in black turtlenecks and spoke in the visionary cadence of a Silicon Valley founder. He personally borrowed against his Wirecard shares, tying his own wealth to the share price and projecting absolute conviction. Conviction, it turns out, is contagious and far cheaper to manufacture than actual profit. Investors mistook his certainty for evidence. That's not the strange part. The strangest figure was a man named John Marszalek, the chief operating officer who effectively ran the opaque Asian operations. He moved through a world of intelligence contacts and offshore intermediaries that had no obvious place in a payments company. When the music finally stopped, Marszalek didn't go to court. he vanished, reportedly fleeing on a private flight and surfacing in associations with Russian intelligence. A payments executive becoming an international fugitive is, by any standard, an unusual career pivot. Paying off our second loop, from as early as 2008, skeptics had been pointing at the accounts and asking simple questions. The Financial Times, led by reporter Dan McCrum, ran investigation after investigation, suggesting the profits were fabricated and the cash was fictional. They published documents, they named names. They were, it turned out, almost entirely correct. Here is the twist that reframes everything. When short sellers and journalists exposed the trick, Germany's financial regulator, BaFin, did not investigate Wirecard. It investigated the journalists and the short sellers. In 2019, BaFin took the extraordinary step of banning short selling of Wirecard stock entirely and filed criminal complaints against reporters for alleged market manipulation. The referee, asked to inspect the magician's sleeves, instead ejected the people in the crowd pointing at them. This is where the thesis sharpens. The failure wasn't a lack of information. The information was published in one of the world's leading newspapers, repeatedly, for years. The failure was that the people empowered to look chose instead to defend the show. BaFin defending Wirecard was, in fairness, a model of consistency. It was wrong from beginning to end. And then there was EY, formerly Ernst & Young, Wirecard's auditor for roughly a decade. An audit exists for one reason: to open the fist and confirm the coin is actually there. The single most basic procedure in finance is to ask a bank directly to confirm a balance. For years, EY relied on documents and screenshots supplied by Wirecard and its intermediaries, rather than obtaining confirmation straight from the banks holding the supposed $1.9 billion. When investigators finally did contact the institutions, the answer was devastatingly simple. One of the trustee arrangements supposedly safeguarding the billions traced back to a small operation in the Philippines, and the country's central bank confirmed that none of the money had ever entered the Philippine banking system. The coin had not moved to another dimension. There was no coin. The audit had certified an empty hand year after year. Across roughly a decade of audits, EY signed off on financial statements built on cash that didn't exist. The firm has argued it was the victim of an elaborate and collusive deception. That may be true, but an audit whose central function is verifying cash and, which never independently verified the cash, has defined victimhood downward in a remarkable way. Under mounting pressure in 2020, Wirecard commissioned a special audit by KPMG to settle the doubts once and for all. KPMG could not verify the bulk of the company's profits from those third-party partners. That report cracked the stage open. Within weeks, the $1.9 billion was declared missing, then declared to probably not exist, a phrase that should never appear next to a quarter of a company's assets. On June 25, 2020, Wirecard filed for insolvency, the first company in Germany's elite DAX index ever to do so. A firm once worth $24 billion was worth essentially nothing within days. Shareholders, including ordinary German savers and pension funds, watched their holdings evaporate. The applause stopped, and the audience finally looked down to find the magician's hand had been empty the entire performance. Marcus Braun was arrested and went on trial in Munich, denying wrongdoing and casting himself as a victim of others' deceit. Jan Marsalek remains a fugitive, now woven into a separate story about European espionage. And BaFin, the regulator that hunted the journalists, was overhauled. Its president forced out. The whistleblowers who had been investigated for years were, of course, vindicated, though vindication is a poor substitute for the years they spent under suspicion. So, return to the thesis. Wirecard did not fall because the fraud was undetectable. It was detected by journalists, by short sellers, by anyone willing to ask a bank whether the money was real. It survived because investors wanted a German tech champion, regulators wanted to defend a national symbol, and auditors wanted a smooth relationship with a marquee client. Every incentive pointed toward keeping the fist closed. That is the uncomfortable lesson, and it pays off the promise we made at the start. A magic trick only works because the audience agrees to be fooled, to accept the misdirection in exchange for the pleasure of the illusion. Wirecard's collapse wasn't a failure of detection. It was a failure of will, the collective decision by sophisticated people who knew better not to open the hand they were always allowed to inspect. The next Wirecard won't be hidden in clever code. It will be standing on a brightly lit stage asking only that you keep watching the wrong hand.